This is, I think, going to be a great panel. We've got a great group of individuals here. We've got a theoretician, we've got some practitioners up here, and we've got the audience. We're going to try to have more of a conversation this morning. But before we start, I want you to think about partnerships. We've been talking about this partnership and collaboration and business models probably for the last 20 years. As a former private sector officer, I used to pull my hair out. As you can see, I don't have very much left. In trying to try to move away forward to try and leverage opportunities with private sector partners, with governments, with NGOs. And it's always kind of been a silo kind of an operation. Well, if you can help me here, that would be good, but if you can't help me here, then it's not going to work out. But I think we will all agree that we've got a world that's moving toward, I think, chaos if we don't figure out a better way to leverage our resources in a much more effective way. You've got 50% of the country, of the world that's going to need to be fed by 2050. That's transformational change. You got 60% of the population in a lot of these countries under the age of 25 years of age. So the days of us just kind of sitting around and doing our nice little projects with our NGOs and getting nice little results, if we don't start figuring out how to do that to scale and do it in a way that leverages, we're going to have serious problems in a lot of these countries. And you know, the water issues go on and on and on. Population in the urban areas where you're going to have 50 to 60% of people living in cities by 2055. So we've got a lot of issues to deal with, and I think the private sector solutions are the way forward. And one of the things I want to try to do this morning is tease out, how can we move things to scale? How do we get more compassion, but empathy, but also partnerships that really force us to think outside the box and really start getting at these larger numbers that we really need to address. So with that, I'm going to set the stage with that question. And I want to start with you, Raj, because you're the theoretician on the panel. You've been at DevEx for longer than I can think, but you've done a wonderful job, but you've also convened a lot of these forums yourself. And what I want to try to do is get to some real solutions today on how we can potentially move forward as an organization.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you, Alonzo, and thank you to Palladium and all of you for being here today. It's great to be part of this. It looks like we shop at the same sock store, Alonzo, thinking of the private sector.
You got the memo. You got the memo.
We've got the stage perfectly framed for all of you. I'm glad that you framed the urgency around these issues this morning, because we can get into a technical conversation, which is pretty exciting for probably some of the geeky folks in the room like myself, on the different structures and blended finance and the way we can make this work. But in the end, there is a goal here. And there is urgency, and we like to use a word like ecosystem, which I see is used in the agenda. Ecosystem is like a nice, fancy word, probably for chaos, the word you used. Somehow all of this crazy spaghetti bowl of initiatives and actors and stakeholders, somehow it all has to work together. You mentioned, and so I thought of it, you mentioned food security, the huge challenge of feeding half the planet by 2050. I'm curious if anybody here knows why the date 1892 was so important in the world of global development. Does 1892 ring a bell for anybody here? It's the year that the tractor was invented. But in most of the countries where Palladium operates, where Alonzo, you've done a lot of work, I think many others in the panel work, the tractor is still a luxury item. It is still not owned or utilized by millions of smallholder farmers, and it takes on average something like 40 days to hand plant a field versus 8 hours with a tractor. And I bring all this up because I want to talk about one specific example of a private sector solution that might not have existed 20 years ago, but that in this moment of real disruption happening in our industry, does exist and is thriving, and it's called Hello Tractor. Anybody heard of Hello Tractor? A couple of hands? Yep. So this is a small startup, started a few years ago. The basic concept was, since tractors are so expensive, people can't afford them, and since the people who do happen to have one can't get much value out of it, they can't get enough utilization out of it, why don't we take the Uber model and apply ride sharing to tractor sharing? And a young man came up with this idea, focused on Nigeria, went to USAID, and went to Development and Innovation Ventures, which is a great example of the kind of instruments I think we're meant to talk about in the panel today. And they said, all right, we'll give you a small grant, $150,000. They were able to prove that this can work. And then they got another slightly larger grant, and they went out and got some investment capital. Today, 75% of the tractors in Nigeria coming to the country use Hello Tractor. 75%. They're now in 5 countries across the continent. And they're radically transforming lives in a way that never would have happened in the old model of big contracts and grants going to service provision. This is something that had to have that blend of private sector initiative, entrepreneurism, grant capital plus investment capital plus new technology. And as you well know, I just came out with a brand new book. It's out just this month called The Business of Changing the World, which basically argues that we're in this moment that we've never seen before in our history. We've seen iterative change, slow change in global development, but we are in a moment now where all of these trends are coming together at once and creating lots and lots of opportunities like a Hello Tractor that can actually get to some of the urgency that you brought up in the introduction.
Okay. Well, Carla, that's a nice transition to you. I understand that Better Cotton has covered about 19% of the cotton market, and potentially you'd like to get it to 50 or maybe even 100%. How do we do that?
Okay, so we are 10 years old, so we've managed to do that in 10 years. And basically the way we've done that is we were started up as a collaboration, and we were started up with impact, with scale in mind. So the stakeholders that came together were governments, were the retailers and brands, and NGOs, the sort of typical NGO as well, but with the retailers and brands and with the governments. And the Better Cotton Standard was put together. So basically the standard works on the farmer level and also at the supply level and also at the demand level. So at the supply level, it's the much more sort of typical NGO approach, I would say. It's improving the capacity of farmers to, as you were saying, climate change and so many things are happening around the world in our environment. We're working with the farmers and 99% of farmers that we work with are smallholder farmers, to improve their yields. So, and it's in the different countries where we work, the standard is tailored to work with the different issues there. And what we do is, so BCI, Better Cotton Initiative, we're 100 staff. We've grown quite quickly, but we started off with much less, but we're still quite small. So we work through implementing partners. So, and the implementing partners at the grassroots level, some are NGOs, but they can be companies as well. They can be businesses. So basically different.
So your success, though, is merited on the fact that you've been able to get to this 19% number, but how do you get to 50%? What kinds of individuals in this room can help you get to 50%?
Okay, so looking at the demand side, we have engaged the retailers and brands. And what we do is, first of all, we stimulated supply. Then once we've got the supply up, then we had to increase demand. So we work with retailers and brands, and what they do is they source better cotton. So that's where we get the investment, I suppose, from the fashion industry. And as a sort of the first speaker was saying, people that work for large companies, profits get you so far, but if you can be motivated, if you can really believe in your company, then they'll get you much further. And that's what we feel that we provide these companies. So they can make claims about the cotton that they secure through BCI, through the standard system. It's one thing. And then for each part of sustainable cotton that they source, they pay money into a fund. And this is where people, this fund is open to different investors. At the moment, it's sort of heavily reliant on the retailers and brands, and it was started up with governments. And this fund will fund the work at implementing level, at the farmer level directly. So unlike organic, for example, where people pay a premium at the top, we bypass that and we go straight down to the bottom so that the investors know that that money is going to go to the farmer. So that creates the virtuous circle.
So Joseph, help us out. You've got 10% of the world's cocoa production. Talk to us about how you're using partnerships to increase opportunities in these communities that we're talking about here.
And I'm a practitioner, I'm not a theoretician. So I have to say that we are lucky enough in the cocoa sector that pre-competitive approach, that partnership approach has been developed for almost 10 years now. And we reach a level where we have huge initiatives that brings along private sector actors, the major brands, the supply chain actors, but also government and civil society. I can name one, which is the Cocoa and Forest Initiatives that have been signed, and I think Palladium through Partnership for Forests is also supporting that initiatives. So I have to say that our level of maturity when it comes to collaboration and partnership is quite high. Now, the difficulty that we are facing since we have achieved that type of maturity is that the more people you bring around the table, the more difficulty you have to define one common denominator that you can fight and stand for. Right. Because within that Cocoa and Forest initiative, for example, you have the supply chain actors, and then you have the brands. Already you have two different interests, two different levels of understanding on what's the challenges and how do you operationalize the challenges on your supply chain. Then you have the government. So what's the political wish and willingness to bring that question forward? And then you have the civil society that is sometimes still holding accountable the private sector only for what the supply chain is, the challenges we're facing on our supply chain. So I think we are at a stage where we need to address systemic issues and not individualized silos issues. We need to think globally, we need to think systemic, and to be able to do so, we need to increase the level of trust.
So why have you been so successful?
Very good question. I think because, well, I think there is different factors. One is like our business is the stereotype of a pure south-north business, right? I mean, and I was listening to one this morning that said the people, they understand that farmers need pesticides, but they don't want the pesticide in their fruits. Our customers, they want cocoa, right? They want chocolate. Right. But they don't want child labor, deforestation. So it's kind of the opposite, right? Mm-hmm. So first of all, it's because it is very simple to understand child labor and deforestation. So there has been an oversimplification of issues that makes everyone aware in the supply chain that we need to work pre-competitively and together. That is one. I think second is like also because our sectors is consolidated into 5, 6, let's say 10 big brands that account for almost 80% of the market. So our capacity to bring those people around the same table is greater than if you have 100 or 1,000 actors. So there is different sectors, and last but not least for cocoa is because on the supply side you have 2 countries that account for 75% of the total cocoa world crop: Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire 50%, Ghana 25%. So with those 2 countries, you're already addressing the vast majority of cocoa farmers and the issues in the supply chains. Yeah.
Dale, you mentioned in our pre-conference that you were looking for a potential partner. Why don't you talk to Joseph about how you could potentially partner with him?
We started that conversation off the floor. So I think it's been fortuitous how this has worked out. There are a few of us here who have definite projects of alignment already. So I'm from Mezzanine. Mezzanine has been working, Mezzanine is a for-profit company, but linking profit and social impact or social good since about 2010 when we started, before it became cool. And we've been struggling away in the early years as a technology company pretty much on our own, and then linked into some larger actors when we realized that the way to get to scale was for us to link into whoever would multiply our impact. And sometimes for us that means linking into channels to market, sometimes that means linking into different partners. So it's a multi-dimensional kind of platform approach to how we operate. And the topic, so we work in health and agriculture and education, but we have an agriculture project that's currently of interest. And I think what you said just now about the complexity of managing multiple stakeholder interests is becoming a reality for us as well. And with the move beyond a country borders, beyond one country, beyond one industry, how do you make sure that there are enough things that are standardized or aligned, but also not losing the flexibility and the agility that we spoke about earlier, and the decentralized decision making that I think allows some of these things to happen. So these are very similar challenges. I think this morning's presentation about the petrochemical, the chemicals and for agriculture, we work with the input companies because that's what farmers need. So we're helping farmers do what they do better and then building ecosystems around that. So we have over 1.1 million smallholder farmers registered in Kenya at the moment, and then quite a number of other projects across other sectors. We had some interesting conversations about numbers yesterday, and I think one of the things that we are also challenged with is we're a technology company, so my personal approach is that technology is a great Trojan horse for transformative policy and business engagement. So it's much easier sometimes in some of the markets we operate in to sell a gadget or a bright and shiny thing. And that's not to say that that will ever solve all the problems, but if you can make sure that with that comes the rest, you're going to be okay. And that's the approach that we take at Mezzanine, and bringing the rest with us.
So Raj, help me understand though, we've got these 3 wonderful activities in the agriculture sector, why we're not able to build those to scale. What are some of the impediments that you see out there over your last 20 years of working in this business?
I think we are getting some of these to scale. I think they're good examples where it's happening, but I think, you know, one of the ideas behind a conference like this, and even a panel like this, is pretty radical in a way, right? Mm-hmm. We're talking about big corporates, you know, Nestle and Mars, and, you know, huge companies in a sector, and not many years ago, even some people today would say, well, they're not part of the global development world. That's the business world. It's a different thing, and maybe we connect in certain places, maybe we connect on certain projects, right? What we're talking about here is pretty revolutionary, actually. It's the idea that the fundamental business itself, the core of the business, getting the cocoa from the trees in a couple of countries where the supply chain sustainability is a question, not just the kind of brand and social license to operate, that actually these companies are part of global development. That a company like Starbucks is like USAID. It's like the Gates Foundation. It's right in the same tent with the rest of us because their supply chain, you know, we go to Starbucks and get coffee and it's from Rwanda or Ethiopia or Guatemala. We don't even think twice anymore about that. These are countries where half the population lives in extreme poverty. Mm-hmm. Right? So the first issue, I think, is just understanding our industry has shifted dramatically, and these players are part of it. And then I think it gets to Joseph's point that we want to get away from just one-off companies announcing a big initiative, announcing a one, you know, there's great actors. There's Nike that got in a lot of trouble in the 90s for their factories and then really turned around and does a lot of great things now. And we want to get to these systemic solutions. And you know who's really good at systemic solutions? USAID, the World Bank, the traditional development actors. That's the way they think. They think about how to partner with government, how to partner with civil society. Businesses often don't. So I think the big opportunity that I'm hearing listening to all of these 3 examples and why we are starting to get to scale is the confluence of those. When we're bringing the best expertise and money from the traditional aid players, we're bringing government and civil society to the table, and then we're bringing what business can offer, which is in itself scale. I remember sitting at an event like this next to somebody from McDonald's, and he explained that this was like the year after they decided to make apples an option for the Happy Meal, just an option. So when you're buying your kid a Happy Meal, you can get the French fries, but now you have a choice. He said the day they made that move, they became the world's #1 purchaser of apples, right? So that's the scale that these kinds of businesses have to offer and why it matters a lot to bring them in the tent.
Joseph?
Yeah, and I recognize that systemic approach is very much needed. I mean, that's where we are today. How do we have an impact? And we all are accountable for the inputs that we're putting into that, not the outcome today. And that's also something very important, that we need to be able to measure the outcome, which is the most complicated stuff. The input is easy to measure, but the outcome is really complex because how do you allocate the outcome? Is it because Tuton or someone else has done something, or is it because of the states? Is it because of the climate condition? I mean, it's very, very complex. Now, I think we need also, by bringing those actors such as World Bank, such as those development agency and USAID, there is also a need to de-oversimplify the messages. The complexity of the supply chain, of the operation is far beyond no child labor in my cocoa or no deforestation in my cocoa. It goes beyond that, and I was.
What do you mean by that? It goes beyond that. Go ahead, because somebody might take that differently. Go ahead. What do you mean by that?
Let me take one simple example.
Okay.
Under the Cocoa and Forest initiatives, we have committed to have no deforestation in our supply chain from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, meaning that where cocoa is produced in the protected area or in national parks, you're not allowed to source that cocoa, right? Once you have said that, how do you set true and proper and accurate traceability tool that gives you the capacity to actually identify whether your cocoa is coming from that area? And it starts with something very simple. What are the GPS coordinates of this area? And it comes from the States, right? And until recently, after 18 months of CFI, we were not having access to that GPS coordinates, right? So once you have the basis of the GPS coordinates, then a proper traceability tool, let's assume that. What do you do with those people? I mean, do you stop just buying from them and you let them in their poverty situation? And what about the human rights? So do you ask the states to come into this protected forest and kick them out of the forest? Right? Because that's what is happening currently. Huh? And the pressure that is under the government of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana is to kick them out of the forest.
So what would you regulate to be done? What do you think should be done in order to ensure that you don't over-legislate for something like this?
I have no single solution. I mean, it's the reality. As a matter of fact, there is no single proper solution today. It's an ideation of idea, of strategy, and I'd like to refer to George's presentation this morning. Is strategy is something you want to try to be unique. I believe you need to be unique in the operationalization of your strategy. Right. Because Carlos Ghosn, I know that he's not very popular currently, but he always said strategy is 10%, operation is 90% of your success. Right. So how do you operationalize that? How do you bring other stakeholders, to your different people in your company? All of that. There is no one single solution.
Oh, you want to speak to that? Go ahead. You were nodding your head. Go for it.
Yeah, no, I think I fully agree. So I come from a supply chain and logistics background in the pharmaceutical sector, reforming public sector in South Africa. And everyone has the grand ideals of what we're solving for. And those are good and right, and we must hold them in mind. But then without understanding and having visibility of the operational issues in often the supply chain, you're often causing more harm than good unintentionally. So as a technology company, the way we approached that was first create visibility and solve the simple problems by digitizing your end users. Who are they? Whether it's a farmer or a clinic or a nurse or a community health worker or a school, digitize that so you know who your people are and where they are and what services or production they're doing, and then what inputs and outputs are relevant to them. And if you know that, you can start building outwards. But if you start at the outer end and kind of try and work your way in, it's almost impossible. And it is complicated to digitize those in-service points because GPS coordinates. In South Africa, we've had a few situations where clinics that exist on paper and on GPSs, you get there and there's nothing. And that's in South Africa. So you can imagine in other places it's much worse. So that last mile visibility and digitization of the building blocks that create an ecosystem or a value chain, whatever we call it, if those aren't digitized, it's almost impossible to create scale in a way that's meaningful, I think, from our view, yeah.
Cole?
I wanted to come back to the issue of the retailers and brands, and there's that sort of mix of the different sectors. So I'd say the way that we're financed at BCI, the retailers and brands are crucial to the success of our model, really. And it took a while to convince them about the mass balance approach, because basically what we're asking them is, we're saying, so basically what happens is the farmers produce 100% sustainable cotton at that source. Mm-hmm. When it goes through the value chain, it gets mixed with other cotton. So we do that intentionally because our aim is for all mainstream cotton to be sustainable cotton. So it's the only way that can happen is through this mass balance approach. So it affects the way that the retailers and brands can make their claims. But once they sort of bought into the model and once they understood that, that what they can do with that model is have a direct impact on what's happening on the ground. And this is what they can then communicate to their customers. So not only does it create sort of better employee feeling, but also the customers can feel good about the products that they buy. And that is becoming more and more important as, the sort of fast fashion becomes in the media and so on. And the other thing I'd like to say, so they contribute to us through volume-based fees. They also contribute to us through membership. And the other members of the supply chain also are members of the organization. So it means that BCI, Better Cotton Initiative, is now self-funded. So we don't need to go and fundraise for the work that we do at BCI. What we do need to fundraise for, and that what I've been brought on to do, is fund the model, the Growth and Innovation Fund, this fund I was talking about. So from one year to the next, the amount that the retailers and brands have contributed to our fund has doubled. So now they're contributing 11 million euro. And what I'm trying to do is then match that funding through philanthropic sources. So we were started with government, we were started with the kind of more philanthropic model, then we kind of went more commercial, and now we're trying to kind of bring the other actors in as well. So, for example, we started talking with the German government, and I think what's interesting is the different things that people expect. So the retailers and brands are looking at it, in terms of their business. They want better cotton, they want sustainable cotton, they want to see that growing. The German government wants to see that, the farmers are going to be have the capacity built, that they're going to gain independence. So I suppose what we're trying to balance now is to satisfy the different markets and, give them the outcomes and the impact that they want to see. So I think that's what I wanted to say to that.
Metrics. Joseph, are we overemphasizing metrics in the work that we do?
We overemphasize the accuracy of the metrics that we're collecting, I believe. And
tell me more.
The banks, for example, they have something that is very heavy in terms of administrative burden, is the KYC, know your customers. For supply chain actors like Tuton, is know your farmers. I'll give you a very simple example. For almost 5 to 6 years now, we're collecting GPS coordinates of farmers, and we also conducting what we call an initial baseline on farmers, on socioeconomics data on farmers. We've been collecting thousands and thousands on data points on farmers and that type of stuff. And then when we try to aggregate them, then we realize, but actually, who are the farmers? Because within a farm, you don't only have one farmers. You have like the sharecropper, and you have the owner, and you have the different people that interact within the farm. So we've been collecting information of people that we thought was the farmers, but actually was someone interacting on the farm. And what we realize is like, so we have the record of the farmers, and then we have the records of who have attending the training sessions. And then we realize like, oh, we have registered the owner, but that's actually the sharecropper that is attending the training sessions. So you have like, okay, that guy, he did not participate to any trainings. And on the other hand, you have the sharecropper that you are not able to register because he's not in your database. And then you don't capture actually the entire systemic part of your farm. So I think we need to rethink our model. We need to be able to catch the granularity, and that's why, of course, digitalization is very important. And we need to rebuild the model that's from the very bottom of the supply chain on how do we aggregate at different stages. And that comes back into our conversation, which is collaboration and partnerships. When you are in the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, for example, you have like thousands, or actually it's 31 companies that have signed the initiatives. We all have different data collecting system, right? And at the end of the day, we are reporting on the same indicators that is already aggregated numbers, right? So we are reporting on apple and orange. And at the end, you aggregate that numbers and you said, my impact is millions of farmers. But you need to disaggregate that to be able to say, indeed, we have the same figures. We are able to actually aggregate these figures together, and it makes sense. And I think, so that's one, proper quality and accuracy data. Then how do you share that? That's the second question, because how do you link that to, it is Tuton, or it's Mondelez, or it's Nestlé, or or it's the government. So who is having an impact? Who is making a difference through his own operation that we can account for an outcome of that specific operation? it's a complex. We've been working on data, and not as long as you are working on data, but for supply chain actors, you know, I mean, we are talking about responsibility, we are talking about accountability. I think we need transparency, and I think data would help us to bring transparency. And I'm not talking about blockchain. Huh? I'm talking about proper data collection system.
You have something against blockchain, huh? Okay. Carla, what do you think?
Okay, I mean, I just wanted to take a slightly different count on this. I think for us, you know, we had our target of, we wanted to reach 3 million farmers by 2020. We're at 2.2 million at the moment. And
how did you come about that 3 million target? How did you go about that?
That's a good question. We had our conference, our annual conference, a couple of weeks ago. And very scientifically, our COO said we were told to shoot for the moon. So we had to, aim high.
Big or go home, huh? Okay.
Exactly.
Right.
We're now looking at the next 10 years, and we're going to shoot for the moon again. I'm not sure what that's going to be yet, but it'll be something equally aspirational. But I think what we're looking at now is we were so focused on the numbers, on reaching the farmers, that we're kind of now trying to catch up with ourselves in terms of our systems and how we sort of manage ourselves. And as I said before, we worked through implementing partners on the ground. In 2013, we had 24 implementing partners. As of now, we have 72, so a huge amount more. And so what we've seen is the kind of level of training, for example, that's being delivered is not uniform throughout. As I said, you know, we have a wide variety of different implementing partners. Some are NGOs, some are for-profit. So they all have different ways of operating. So we're actually now kind of trying to take a step back a bit and, you know, think about what is it that we really want to achieve. We want to, you know, make life better for the farmer. And so we need to kind of step back a bit now and try and get our systems and kind of ensure a cohesive approach to the different stakeholders, different farmers there. So I think that's what we're looking at now, and you know, talking to Dale about technology and how technology can help us.
We got about 12 minutes to go, and my thesis sentence still stands. You know, we got to feed 50% more people by 2050. We've had a lot of nice ideas, but I'm still not feeling transformational change. I'm not feeling scale. So what am I missing here? What am I not connecting here? Somebody help me out here. And audience, get ready for questions. I'm going to get you guys involved because I know you want to ask some good questions. I don't want to wait till the last 5 minutes to do that. So please start passing out the microphone so folks can ask questions, okay? Thanks.
I'll just underline something that Dale said, which is this opportunity around digitization. You're right, it's hard. You're right, figuring out what the right metrics are is hard. There's not a lot of standardization.
Hold on, it's development. We know it's hard.
Yes.
I mean, everybody in the room knows it's hard. Give me something else. I need something else from you guys. Come on.
The other thing we do in development often is we look at what happened before, right? And we're in such a different moment now. I'm not sure we fully tuned into the reality that we're just a few years away from ubiquitous internet connectivity.
Right.
From cell phone access everywhere.
Right.
From smartphones, remote sensing devices, wearables, everywhere and cheap.
Right.
Right. From artificial intelligence and from drone access. Like a lot of the stuff we're talking about is really hard to do right now. Right. It's a lot easier now than it was 10 years ago.
Exactly.
But what's going to be possible 5 years from now is going to be really transformative. So I think the issue isn't the tech, because that's coming anyway. The issue is, can we get together to set up the business models and mechanisms so that when we can actually know what the results are, when the metrics aren't a problem anymore, they're an enabler, and when employees and customers demand to know what those metrics are and demand to know them in real time. You know, we come from an industry that was very project-oriented. You issue a midterm review and a final report 3 years later. Those days are going away fast, right? So this is going to become a comparative advantage in these industries. I think it already is in many ways, and that's the thing that's going to start pushing us. In many ways, the scale is there. You know, people are buying lots of cotton. It's just a lot of it is not sustainable. People are buying lots of cocoa. It's just a lot of it is fueling, you know, child labor. It's not that the scale isn't there. It's a question, how do you take the scale that exists and use it in a way that has positive impact in the world?
Joseph, you believe that?
I believe in business opportunity, and I believe in investment.
Okay.
And I think what we are facing today is we have a clear need for big investments. And investment in
whom? From whom?
From the private sectors, from people that have the capacity to bring those investment into real concrete
but most banks want to make money, right? Most businessmen want to make money. Why aren't they investing?
Because I think, I mean, and I talk on behalf of Tuton, and I don't pretend to know the other sectors and the type of activities. the long-term vision for sustainability and sustainable cocoa is there. I mean, it's clear for us. You know, cocoa and forests are interconnected. If there is no forest, there will be no cocoa. If farmers remain poor, then there will likely good chance that they'll move into the city to find a job. Although in West Africa, we have the different issues because we have migration from the north to the south, from Mali, from Burkina. You know, in western part of Côte d'Ivoire, 75% of the farmers that are registered in our database are not Ivorians. They are coming from Burkina, they are coming from Mali. So, you know, you can start having really systemic issues. But I also think, like for Touton, for example, what we realize is maybe tomorrow our business model is not to source cocoa and sell cocoa. It's actually to sell services to those farmers. Right. And Hello Truck is like, okay, I don't have the means to buy a truck, I need to rent one, right? Maybe tomorrow our role, because we have that capacity to reach those farmers, because we're buying their products, right? Maybe our job will be to sell services, agri services, social services to them. And for example, that's an idea that has been around the sectors for some times already. And because we are an agri company, then we started with agro services to those farmers. But how could you sell a 10 years loan to a farmers for rehabilitation where tomorrow he won't have money to buy food? Right? So we were trying to fix, we assume what the farmers needs was rehabilitation, because then he can increase his yield, then he can score more revenue because he's gonna get more cocoa and that type of stuff. That what we realize today is like, what they need is food, right? What they need is a cold chain so they can store food. What they need is access to electricity so they can plug their device and then we can maybe digitalize them. So I think we need to have, and I like the word radicality. I think thinking out of the box is a nice word, and it's a buzzword that has been used for many years in the development world. I think we need to radically think differently. I think we need to put our shoes, to have empathy, that capacity to understand the needs of the people we're trying to work with, because we're not trying to save them, we're trying to work and to get revenue out of their activities, because as a private sectors we need a bottom line that is positive so we can invest back into supply chains. So I think we need that type of philosophy. Where is the business opportunity? And Hello Truck is a perfect example, right? It's a startup that's started from almost nothing, okay, just a good idea, and now 70% of the trucks in Nigeria are, so this is where the opportunities are. If you want to bring skills, you need to bring long-term business case, which is something that we more or less all agreed on, but you need to bring short-term businesses.
Dale, you believe what Raj said, that the scale is there, we just need to figure out how to bring it together?
I think coordination is a huge part of it, and the term that we use...
How do we coordinate better? So we use that term all the time as well. So we need to coordinate better.
Internally,
but we're not getting any bigger.
The term honest broker. So who are the honest brokers that pull together these stakeholders? And how do we align the incentives of the people who we need to pull together? So the cotton grower, the buyer, the person who's selling the inputs, the tractor guy, whoever they are, there has to be a universe where all their incentives can align towards an end goal that we're interested in. So what do we care about, and how do we align those incentives, and who will play the honest broker? And being an honest broker, does it mean that it has to be an NGO? Can it be a for-profit? Is it okay that we allow skin in the game for the honest broker? And we think that that is the most sustainable approach. So yeah, I think finding the honest brokers who can pull the right networks together, because there are great ideas all over. The scale exists already. Coca-Cola can get Coke to the last mile. Why can't we get medicines to the last mile? Everybody's working on these things in silos, but I think finding those honest brokers and making sure that they're mandated with the right standards and governance so that we can be clear about how do we measure things and what inadvertent harm can come, and try and avoid that wherever possible, but also not lose the agility. So we don't need a new bureaucratic organization to bureaucratize a new way of doing things. It has to be something that is agile and but still governable.
Okay. Carla, you want to add real quickly?
I totally agree with Raj. The scale is there, and for cotton, definitely. I mean, I think that's the essence of what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure that the mainstream cotton that's produced is sustainable. So what that means for us is, we are working with smallholders, we are working with farmers in very sort of poor environments, but we're also working with large farms. We're talking about mainstream cotton, making cotton mainstream, so we have to work with everybody. Yeah. And we've got to the stage now with our retailers and brands that they're coming to us and asking us where to go next. So they're asking us, for example, they want us to go to Egypt. Egyptian cotton is high quality cotton. They don't have a standard in Egypt yet, so we have been asked to go into Egypt and work with people there to make sure that Egyptian cotton can be sourced sustainably so that they can buy sustainable cotton from Egypt. And I think that's the stage that you want to get to. You want to get to that stage where you've got this sort of virtuous circle going on. And it means that the funding that we get, as I guess again from our volume-based fees, we can then choose to put that funding into where the countries need it more, and with the support of the large farmers that are bringing in the scale, so that we can get to our 100% sustainable cotton.
Last question. Who should be the convener of bringing all this together? I mean, is it AID? Is it DFID? Is it DFAD? Who should be is it the private sector? Is it the bankers? Is it private family holdings? Who should be the convener to bring all this together to really get it to scale where we need it to be?
I don't know that this is one size fits all, but I think these are probably examples just here, right? And depending on the industry or on the sector, you might create a new initiative, you might have a trade association that already exists. Maybe you don't have anything, and so you need some of the players that are big in the space to fund something that starts up. I think to Dale's point about profit, nonprofit, one of the big shifts that I argue in my book is coming is we're moving away from this idea that there's a nonprofit and there's a for-profit, right? And that we think much more strategically. And so you can have an organization that's not profit maximizing. It's not out there to squeeze every penny it can out of what it does. It has a mission, but it still knows that some amount of profit is important for its ongoing sustainability. So I think we're seeing more of these blended models come up. And if you look in the development sector, what's really worked in the last 15 years or so, it's been these alliance models. It's been things like Gavi on vaccines, the Global Fund, it's been the Hand Washing Alliance. There's about 50 of these things. And each
Isn't it ironic that it's always the health sector that pulls this off?
Health has kind of dominated in a way. You know what? Partly because of the metrics. Partly because in many ways it's a lot easier to measure and to equate input with output. But it's starting to move into other sectors, and ag is a great example because there is a sustainable business model behind ag.
Mm-hmm. Joseph?
We need catalysts more than convener, I think.
Okay.
People we need front runners that brings idea on the table, that invest, and that educates other stakeholders around us that there is a business case, there is a reason to do that.
But let me stop you there for a second. The reason I asked the question the way I asked it is because of the fact that we keep saying we need catalysts, but for some reason we're still not coming together. So the catalyst is always going to be out there, but it seems like there's not this one entity that comes together and says, look, we're going to take 1, 2, 3, 4, bring them together and move forward on this potential process. And it's not happening. So I'm not convinced that the catalyst is it either. I'm having an argument here with you, so help me out.
Very right. No, very right. And I can give the example of the Climate Smart Cocoa project that we have in Ghana, supported by Palladium and Partnership for Forests. We've been the front runner of that project for the last 3 years. And actually, the burning question is who is going to take the convening role? Because what we learn is that as a private sectors, as a company with the private sectors, you are not able to convene the rest of the stakeholders. You can bring some, you can start initiating some stuff, but then what's the question? Is it the states, the Forestry Commission? Is it a development organization? I think there is no one single solution.
The reason I say it again, once again, is that the health sector has been able to do this unimpeded, partially because of the incredible amount of funding that they get and also the innovation. But help me understand how we can do this on the private sector side. That's what I'm trying to get. How do we find that nucleus? Not a silver bullet, but that nucleus of individuals that come together and start to put together those kind of processes on the private sector side.
I think Better Cotton Initiative is a good example because it's either when you are in a group of different stakeholders, a multi-stakeholders engagement, either you look for the high bar and there is likely good chance that you're not going to make it, right? Because you have too many different interests, you have too many different positioning in the stuff. Not saying that the BCI is not the high bar, huh? Just saying that when you are in a multi-stakeholders initiatives, you first need to clearly define what's the minimum common denominator that you have all in common.
Right.
And that would help you to, it's a pathway. There is no finish line, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just milestones after milestones after milestones. Then you build that. And BCI is a perfect example. Now you're representing 90% of the markets on the supply and on the demand. You have secured the retailers that we have not been able to do in the cocoa sectors, for example, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there is different way of doing it.
Okay, I heard grumbling from the intellectual tower over here, so give them a microphone. I heard a bunch of grumbling going over here, and let's see if we can get some other questions, okay? Yes, ma'am, you're up first.
Thank you. This has been a really, really interesting panel. I've paid very close attention. My name is Linda Cahalan, and I am with the Bureau for Global Health at USAID. So in USAID right now, there's a lot of buzz around the journey to self-reliance, sustainability, and seeing private sector as a big part of both those things. I guess my question is very broad, and we're beginning to work on some of these issues. I'm obviously in the health sector. What is your advice for USAID in terms of working with the private sector? Some of our work is at the local level in terms of transitioning the work and the funding, et cetera, to local partners. But we're having, I think, a little more trouble moving from corporate responsibility funding into true partnership at a higher level, the global level. So what's your advice to USAID?
I don't work for them anymore. You guys, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to get a chance to give some advice to USAID. I think it's a big question, right? And obviously the agency is thinking a lot about this. I have a couple of thoughts. One is to get away from the big brands, right? We often, when we all go to these events and we see the same kind of usual suspect front-leading companies on stage, and they're doing great work, but it's often the systemic issues that are the key thing behind it, and I think that's where USAID actually has much more to offer, is to figure out what are the systemic problems, and often it's dealing with small and medium-sized enterprises. It's not necessarily dealing with the biggest brands. The big brands have a lot of pressure on them. They've got their employees, they've got their customers, they need to move in many ways. It's often the small and medium enterprises that may not have the same pressures, or maybe it's just a top-down pressure, and I think USAID can help to unlock some of the opportunities that are there, and that might mean instead of saying, which I think historically the agency has said, well, most of our money goes through our contract and grant mechanisms, and then we got a little money over here for innovation. We've got some exciting things that we're going to do on innovation, but they're small. But instead to bring those things together so that when you find the systemic challenges, you can put real money behind them to push change at the systems level that ultimately changes the way small and medium enterprises can function more sustainably. That will ultimately lead to the big brands that we're talking about here on stage. I mean, that's easy to say, but to me, that's more in line with a self-reliance journey than having the two sides of the house do really different things.
You want to add? Go ahead real quick if you want to
Yeah.
add. Next question up after this, okay?
So Mezzanine has worked in the health environment for a number of years, since 2010, and I think we've got a few examples of where it's worked really well working with the USAID funded partners, and a few where it's worked really poorly. And one of our main challenges is the duration and inflexibility of the timeline. So when a cool idea comes up and we're saying we're ready, the people who have the big mechanisms are saying, well, we'd love to involve you, but we don't have a line item, or we don't have a way of building you into the plan. So that's the one thing. And then the second thing is coordination amongst the other donors. So in South Africa, we set up a really great governance body to help coordinate and say who's contributing X amount and how can we quantify how you're contributing to the impact in the country level, as opposed to having siloed project approach. And then always the health system strengthening, linking into the other processes as opposed to seeing them separate. Because in the operations, the nitty-gritty, that's where the impact is felt. So I could have a full day discussion on this, and it's a topic, and I'm coming to find you afterwards.
You want to add something to that? CARLA?
Just very quickly, I think the key, I think I'd agreeing with Dale. I think that one of the big problems is trying to satisfy the two different markets. What the institutional funder is, and that's my background, institutional funding. What the institutional funder is looking for, and what the retailer and brand, or what the private sector is looking for, are different things. So how we can kind of work together to kind of harmonize that would make certainly my life a lot easier. And also, I think just getting into the sort of mindset of the private sector. You know, in our case, it's retailers and brands, and so they get out of it what they want, you know, and what's profitable for them.
Next question, please.
I'm Scott Kleinberg with the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, formerly with USAID. Getting to your question about scale, Alonzo, I think that there are kind of two observations I would make. One is that donors don't talk about scale when they're designing the program, and they don't talk about exit. And so as a result, when the money runs out, a lot of times everything stops. And surprisingly, this is a blind spot in economic growth as much as anywhere else, which is where you would think it would be easiest to develop the private sector engagement and the partnerships and the collaboration. Right. The other piece is there's a whole domain missing from the conversation, which is philanthropies and family offices, you know, not at the Gates level, but at the multi-million-dollar level, maybe at the multi-hundred-million-dollar level, that we don't engage with. And they're all operating. They're building hospitals, they're supporting clinics, they're supporting agricultural enterprises.
Why don't you share with the audience who you work with right now?
The Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, we're working on agricultural transformation in Malawi. And we don't have a geography for how donors and the private sector and philanthropies all can work together. And when you talk about convening, the donors don't play that role in convening philanthropies. And so they're missing from the conversation. And so, you know, what domain do you see, what opportunity do you see in that role for convening instead of implementing? Maybe donors should be convening more and providing a place for everyone to talk.
Great takeaway. Anybody want to touch that?
I'd
like to hear your thoughts on that as well.
just quickly, I managed the transition between a private foundation-funded and USAID-funded project, large project for primary healthcare clinics in South Africa. It's now fully funded by the local government. The key ingredients in that was having long-term planning and visibility, because it takes in government in South Africa 2 to 3 years to build the business case and mobilize the resources. That means it's longer in some other places. The business case in mobilizing the resources doesn't mean just the fiscus, the local fiscus. It can mean those other entities, whoever they are. So I think moving from a siloed funding approach to a pooled funding approach for these kinds of initiatives is critical. How can we pool the resources and then be able to attribute impact in a way that makes sense for the people who are putting the money in?
Okay, Raj, you're it. And then I'm sorry, I know there are other questions out there, but I'm getting the evil eye from the timekeepers. So I need to stop after this.
I'll just do a very quick thing, which is on this issue of the foundations, right? You're right, there's lots of smaller and mid-sized ones, but let's not forget that it's not just Bill Gates at the highest level, right? I'm just curious, who here has heard of Carrie Tuna and Dustin Moskowitz? Not many hands up. So they are already bigger donors than the Rockefeller Foundation. And they are on their track to be bigger donors in the Ford Foundation, which those are the two kind of iconic foundations of the last century, right? There are now 2,000 billionaires in the world, of which they're just one couple. Of those 2,000 billionaires, about 10%, 204, have signed the Giving Pledge. Total assets of $9 trillion across that group. There is more money flowing in the space than I think we tend to realize in the development sector, and it is going to get to the scale. Already some of it's at the scale of government, but it's going to get to the scale of government. You're going to see a lot more specialization as a result, where the USAIDs of the world say we've got to operate in some of the poorest, most conflict-ridden parts of the world, and foundations might say, well, we're going to go to the middle-income countries and places that are more stable. But I think the scale of that funding is starting to really disrupt the way we work and ought to be part of our understanding, just like we think of the technology revolution coming forward.
Okay. Thank you very much. I want to thank the panel again.